Vinten lecture. This being the RSA and this being a formal lecture series, I thought I would prepare a formal erudite lecture. But I see that one of you have got copies of it, so I'm going to rumble you and not read it out. And there are copies there for those who want to read it afterwards, but I'm just going to talk you through some of the ideas I think are relevant in today about this fantastically exciting continent, which is a country, which is India, a country full of challenges, but full of fantastic potential. And I think the RSA is a very good place to do that. As Joy said, you've had a bit of a history going back, but actually there's a more modern history to it as well, and two of the founders of the RSA chapter in India, who was a bit late getting going, it started in 2003 or 4, are here tonight with us, so it's great that the RSA has a living link to India as well. In Britain we see India in a certain way and get very excited about India, and Indians too get very excited about what India really means. And there's no end of literature written about things called being Indian, question mark. What does it actually mean? So an idea of India. Nehru himself wrote a very challenging book about that, back to prisons when he was in a British prison. One of the best reads there is on modern India. And this fascination with India, I think, is something that comes out of two pretty important things that we need to take away from us tonight. First, the two words that immediately occur when you talk about India, one is complexity and the other is diversity. And it's this sense of not quite being clear what constitutes the real India that I think makes it, for us, one of the most exciting things to think about. And particularly for people with an RSA interest, because so much of the values that the RSA stand for are relevant to India in the 21st century. India is, of course, we tend to think of India from Britain as a country and we sort of pigeonhole it. But India is a continent as diverse and much bigger than Europe. And the differences between Kerala and Kashmir are at least as big as between Portugal and Poland. And you have to remember that in India there are, 18 languages in the constitution. I may have got the number wrong, but quite a large number. Hundreds of languages beyond that. On my calculation, I think you use a dozen scripts in India, of which Devanagari, which we know outside India as the Hindi script, is only just one of the many others that are used. So you've got this huge seething area of the world and of humanity, which is a vital melting pot in its own right, and extremely diverse. Contrast China, India and China about the same size. India overtakes China in 2035, I think is the current plan, but you never know, it might actually beat China earlier. But India overtakes China then as to be the second, then to become the biggest country in the world. But over 90% of Chinese, are Han Chinese, the same ethnic group. India is a complete mix of people from the Indo-European north to the Dravidian south, and there are as many different ethnicities as there are different elements in Indian society. So a much more complex, diverse country than anywhere any of you have ever experienced. And I've lived, as you've heard from Joy's brief resume, in many countries around the world. Nothing comes near to India in terms of its complexity and its diversity. It's also quite politically diverse and complex. There are, I think, 28 different states in the constitution, very decentralised polity. Each of those states is about the size of France or Germany or Britain. Some are bigger. There's one called UP, which on the last count was somewhere between 150 and 200 million people. And they've lost counting, they can't actually track how big it is. I mean, a scale that we just don't begin to understand in the West. So, complexity and diversity. Take religion. India is a Hindu culture, and there are literally millions, there are debate about how many millions, of different Hindu deities. And once you've begun to learn your way around that, there's plenty more beyond that in other religions. But before I go on to those, just a quick flashback to a time I had in Bangalore back in, I suppose, 2004 with Jack Straw, who was then the Foreign Secretary at the time. And we were in Bangalore doing new modern India. And Jack said, let's go and see the temple. So off we went to see a wonderful Hindu temple there, taken round by a marvellous priest wearing orange sort of gowns and things like that. And we tracked down, he showed us all the deities and how they were sort of washed and dressed every day, and explained it extremely eruditely. And as we left, Jack said, thanks very much, your English is fantastic. And he said, I must get off now, I've got to get back to my job. So he said, job? I thought you were a priest. He said, no, I'm a lay priest. And he lived on his motorbike, and he said, I work for Microsoft. And so here you have, in 21st century India, somebody deeply spiritual, genuinely deeply spiritual, and works for Microsoft. And that's quite a good snapshot of really something very important about India. So there's the Hindus. Once you move off the Hindus, there are about 150 million, 170 million Muslims in India. India is probably the second biggest Muslim country in the world. I mean, Pakistan is the rival. Indonesia comes first. And then you've got Sikhs, and you've got Catholic Christians, and you've got Parsis, and you've got many other Jains, many other religions coming along behind, all living cheek by jowl in a very cohesive way. When I was High Commissioner, the top 3 people in India were a Muslim, remember, it's a Hindu country, right? Were a Muslim president, a Catholic foreign-born party leader who pulled all the strings, and a Sikh prime minister. Now, there's no other country in the world that has that diversity richly working together right at the top of power. And you have to take a hat off to that ability to make a country function with so many different religions. And that comes to a second very important point to understand about India, old India and modern India. And that is India's secularism. In Britain and in Europe, when we say secular, we tend to mean non-church. The French make a virtue out of this. Written into the constitution, you can dare to show any signs of religious affiliation in India. In France, we've had it. In India, all these religions live very comfortably together. But each respects each other's space, so that the spirituality is there, but the secularism means that you don't actually intrude more than you have to just to coexist in society. And early in my days in Delhi, we had a very interesting discussion in our drawing room when Prince Charles came out. As you know, Prince Charles is a very spiritual man, and he wanted to talk about this element of spirituality in India. So we assembled only one of each of the faiths I've just described, including a Jewish representative from Kerala, because one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world is in Kerala. And these dozen people sat around our drawing room and talked about spirituality and secularism in India and how much this was a vital part of how people had the Indian spirit ticks. So I just leave that thought with you. You can't understand India unless you understand something about spirituality and secularism. That can lead to political complications, and let's be open and honest about this. One of the great drivers of the Hindu culture, a strong and powerful driver, has been the Hindutva movement, which at one level is there to make sure that these Hindu principles and everything that people stand for is central to people's lives, but at times can get more invasive of the space of other religions than they like, and there have been clashes over past years that we can talk about in discussion if you like, which just remind you how in this very secular and very tolerant society, not far beneath the surface, things can go wrong. I mean, it's fantastic how they've managed to come back from those problems and keep the secular thing going. Now, why is India like this? Just a word of history here. We tend to think of India, for Britain, and this is something I criticise every time I can about the British thinking, as a sort of 300-year India, 300-year relationship. When the map was pink and Britain was involved with India. And even in this building, I have to say, the RSA has had in the past a certain view of India of that period. Remember how far back India goes, 4,000 years, before we in these islands were anything remotely social or civilized. Vedic mathematicians were discovering zero and recognizing Pythagoras' theorem several centuries before Pythagoras was even born. I mean, he was a seriously deep and ancient culture. And down the centuries, this comes back to my complexity issues, down the centuries, the millennia, India has been invaded, mostly from the northeast, waves and waves of invasions. And we in Britain have been invaded. down the centuries. And if you look at our Celtic culture, went towards the west, that's because we were forced back by the Angles and the Saxons and then the Normans, and then thank God they stopped. But we've had that same penetration from abroad that India's had. But there's a big difference. We tended to fight and resist and then withdraw, hence Wales, Scotland. And the Indians tended to fight and resist a bit, but then basically absorb. And so the great strength of this modern Indian culture is the ability to absorb wave after wave of foreign invader. If you think of perhaps the most famous dynasty in India, which is the Mughals, we now think of as almost by definition, this is India, the great Mughal culture. Of course, they were invaders who came down from what is now Afghanistan and imposed their will for a while, and then India just took them over and absorbed it. And I make this point because I think it's a terribly important point for India going forward, which is really my main theme for tonight. India has this ability to adjust, to absorb, and has a diversity which is unique in the 21st century of big nations. America is a melting pot, and millions of people coming into America, getting probably more diverse ethnically all the time. But America is basically monocultural, and India, as I've just been saying, is absolutely the opposite. And I think in this global village of the 21st century, as the world gets very complex and that we're into a new ballpark for how nations interact together, India's deep understanding of this complexity will stand it in particularly good stead, because the value system that comes out of that is something that the 21st century is going to need, and I think learn to value, once the traditional, what we call Westphalian nation states of the 19th and 20th century, that didn't work, and we need a much deeper and more complex society to take things forward in this century. And India's day is coming, indeed is already there in many ways for that. So that's my global village point about the diversity of India. And China doesn't have that for the many reasons that you can guess. It's having been so monolithic in its, monocentric in its ethnical and civilizational history, it doesn't have that diversity that India has. That makes it more efficient, but it probably makes it less stable. And that's, I'm prepared to put some money on that. Anyway, I must now get back to the real world of today and the future. As the French say, let's get back to our sheep, revenir à nos moutons. In India, I'm not sure what the answer to that is, probably, but it's dormouse. Let me just say a word or two about India's current economy and politics, and where we go from here with the 21st century. First, the economy. India is a massive economy that is growing on aggregate pretty well, 7 or 8% for the last 2 or 3 years. We'd all love to have that. Trend growth is about that too, 7 or 8%. So I think you can be confident that going forward for the next 10 years, India will do that. They passed the recession of 2 years ago with barely a blip, partly because it's still quite introverted and inward-looking economy, but partly because there's just a vibrancy and a strength there which is taking India forwards. The spending middle class in India, we normally estimate, is growing by about the population of Australia every year. So it gives you a sort of sense of the rate of growth of that of this huge country. But against, and some of the richest people in the world are Indian. And some of them buy up British companies, which is a nice reversal of how we used to see things in the past. And I spent a lot of my time as High Commissioner trying to encourage that, because it seemed to me that there was a very good link between our two countries that we should do that. And I'm glad that the Tatars, for example, made such a success of the Land Rover Jaguar deal, which I was a bit involved in when I was there. But that's symptomatic of Indian economic excellence abroad. But India is basically a poor country, a very poor country. So about a quarter of the income per head of China today. And it's got about 500 million people living on $2 a day. So you're talking millions who go to bed hungry. And that's an important challenge to the present government. And as their very distinguished Prime Minister, Dr. Manmohan Singh, an alumnus of both Cambridge and Oxford, not many people have done that, as he is wont to say, there are 4 or is it 5 centuries coexisting in India today. And he's absolutely right. And there are parts of India which are medieval, and there are parts of India which are more than 21st century. They're out there forging ahead, actually cutting the mustard and changing the 21st century. So, as you change all this, what do you need to do? You just create more jobs. Those jobs are mostly happening in the towns, insofar as they are being created at all. So you've got happening today in India, which is basically rural population. 60% of Indians live in the countryside, at a time when the world now, I think last year we crossed the threshold, the world for the first time lives more in towns than in non-towns. It's the first time in global history. Anyway, India hasn't got there yet, but it's catching up really fast, and I think you're going to see in the next 10 years one of the biggest migrations in world history as young people from the villages move into the towns in search of jobs. That will create huge pressure on the infrastructure in India. It is already. India's infrastructure is, let me be honest, appalling. I mean, it's catching up quite fast, but from a very low base in comparison with, say, China. If you've got cities like Delhi and Mumbai absorbing 500 million people a year, half a million people a year, it's a huge influx of people into cities that can barely cope. So, top of the agenda of the present Indian government, and the High Commission, I'm sure will bear this out, is to build up and modernise India's infrastructure. Not just urban infrastructure, roads, railways, everything else that goes along with it. Basically, India needs to build a new Chicago every year. And it being India, that won't happen in a sort of top-down directive way. This is not China. One of the great strengths of India is not China. It's what people, I think, like lovingly call it functioning anarchy. But it works, some of it mostly works. But for those who are interested in economic development in India, infrastructure is really one of the most interesting areas to look at and to see where it's going to go, partly because the Indians are trying to bring in outside help and investment as they do that. So there's huge opportunities there. The social implications of that are also going to be very significant. And you're seeing that already. There's a very entrepreneurial spirit in every Indian. I'm sure many of you who are Indian, those who work with Indians will realise it's in the DNA of Indians to be entrepreneurial. So when you get these masses coming into the towns and the smaller towns, they're pretty entrepreneurial. And some of these cities are burgeoning in a way that is really very exciting but mind-boggling. And cities that you've never heard of, I mean, the big ones that you probably still haven't heard of are getting bigger. Coimbatore, Indore, Pune, those sort of places. But beneath that, third-tier cities are 1 million strong and growing, and they're places I've never heard of. And that is going to be, I think, one of the kernels of social and economic dynamism over the next decade in India, assuming that the infrastructure is all right. So a very exciting change, social change that are happening in the smaller towns becoming cities, for which the RSA, 21st Century Enlightenment, it seems to me our mission in the RSA absolutely fits with that societal change that needs new ideas that translate tradition, that wonderful history in India, into 21st century needs and results. So much for functioning anarchy in the economy. Another very important thing we wanted to know and remember about India, I've come to my 3 Ds, I've given you one, which is diversity, but the next most important one is demography, with a G. Japan, China, Europe, America, Russia in spades, we're all growing old, quite fast, some of us, and that is exactly the opposite of what's happening in India. India is basically a young person's country. 60% are under 35. There are more young people under 25 in India than the entire European population. So, in the decade of 2030, when we're even older than we are now, and got no workers, India is the workforce of the world, potentially. And that is one of the most exciting things for India's future. But it doesn't happen just like that. It's a challenge because, flashback to that very poor society, in the poor villages, education is absent or weak, at the very best. And so India's second big challenge, alongside infrastructure, is human infrastructure, if you like. Building up that capital which is educating young people. Now, India has a fantastic tradition of education. Those involved in the educational area with India will know already. And Britain has benefited from that from many decades. Ramanujan at Cambridge, Amartya Sen at Cambridge. I mean, it's mentioned today. We just started a new King's Institute Indian Institute at King's, as Joy mentioned. India has some fantastically talented top academics and a fantastically strong intellectual tradition. But if the basic education is not there, then these young people, who could be the workforce of the world in the 2030s, become a burden on India, not its main blessing and strength. So that, I think, is a real challenge for India, but with a real potential. And I say, if I have to take away two messages from here tonight, the first one is watch this space called education and India. And I think quite strongly we shouldn't just watch. We RSA members and fellows need to get out there and join that. We've got in the audience here tonight Mike Knowles, who's very actively doing that in the design area. Very exciting work happening, just to link into some of these young people doing interesting things potentially in India, but linked into the expertise we've got in that field of Britain. There's any number of opportunities like that out there, and I really strongly plead to you all to think a bit about education, your children, your grandchildren, and the link to India. So that was my second D, demography. I'll come back to another one in a minute. A word now perhaps about politics, before I then finally talk about India and the outside world. Politics, well, my third D is obviously democracy. I mean, India is a deep democracy under any standards. It votes all the time, 70% plus turnouts. They love elections in India. They are genuine elections. They are secret. They happen so often that they're always one around the corner. And in India, when you vote, remember it's a country with 500 million people on $2 a day. India, every single person votes, and they often do, electronically. You see pictures of elephants going up in the mountains with a laptop electronic voting machine on their back. It's true, it happens. And every election that happens in India, and they happen every 4 years at national level, is basically the biggest election in world history. I was there for one in 2004, there's been one then since, which is even more electors, and the next one in 2013 will be the same again. So really quite an astonishing feat of getting 700 million voters to vote electronically, and the next day they tell you what the answer is. Paul and I were in Washington and way back in the turn of the millennium, and I went from Washington via London to Delhi. And in my tail end of my time in Washington, we had the great Democrats versus Republican debate about these dimpled chads in Florida. And if you remember those things, sort of funny punched holes in cards. And in Britain, we're pretty primitive about how we run elections too. Well, when in doubt, look at India, because they do it very efficiently and very effectively. When you go into the booth in India, like Britain, it's a secret vote, so all those votes really count. And it's a functioning democracy in the classic definitional sense of the word, that basically every election the incumbents lose office because the electorates are fed up with their non-performance and they get rid of them. So there's a rule of thumb in India: if you're in government, you're likely to lose at the next election. There are some quite interesting exceptions to that when Chief Minister or whoever actually does begin to deliver. So that's an interesting lesson. And now, I mustn't gloss over this, India is deeply corrupt in many ways, and when you've got elections happening all the time, and they're very expensive running an election, you have to get your money somehow, and some can afford it, some can't, and find ways to do it. So what happens outside the booth, in terms of promises or arm twisting or whatever, is not quite the same as what happens inside the booth. And so there's an issue there of Indian democracy, as I say, is very deep, right down to the village panchayat level. It can be even one of the best things, about how the interface between corruption and democracy, which every democracy faces, but India faces too. A third point that's relevant to understanding Indian politics is decentralization. I started saying how complex and diverse was this continent, all those states, or even beneath the states, there are lots of elections happening all the time. And I think, I will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think for the average Indian, the first point of political identity, apart from your village, your very local community, is your state. It's not India as a whole. It's you're a Keralite, you're from Kerala, you're from Kashmir, or if if you're from Punjab. And so the power of the chief ministers and the governments in these areas is A, very important, very extreme, and B, the elections there are as exciting and as interesting as the national elections. With the result that if you look back for the last 20 years, roughly, 15 years anyway, there's been no single party able to rule India with a majority across India. Congress Party clearly has been the mainstay of modern Indian democracy, but nowadays it has to govern in coalition. And this regionalism, which happens on the right of centre parties as well, the NDA, I think is a very important factor of understanding modern Indian politics. And I don't want to get into a sort of detailed discussion about that, but it's important for one particular reason, that most regional politicians and most regional parties are in politics for a regional or a local goal. Their ambitions are local, they're not India-wide or global. And so when you've got this huge continent that needs modernising and steering, that's the way that the current government in India is very nobly trying to do, Manmohan Singh, you're held back all the time because the people you've got to get votes from in Parliament actually are there for local and regional reasons, not for national reasons. And I have a worry about the current situation of modern India facing the challenges but the potential for the 21st century. It's this dichotomy between a decentralised polity, which is throwing up more and more elections and more people who are actually holding back this sort of central direction and change that you need. Now, that's a very stable solution. India will never implode. China, who knows? But if you want to get things modernised, top-down direction is quite an efficient way of doing it. And there's a tension, a very interesting tension, between the two different cultures, these two giants of the 21st century, of how they do things. Final word is on politics. India is a very open society. Millions of newspapers, which all seem to make money. I don't know how anybody gets money out of broadsheet nowadays, but they do. Everybody reads a lot. Everybody argues all the time. I mentioned Amartya Sen wrote a book about the argumentative Indian. It's absolutely true. Politics, ideas, it's a very live and open culture. And corruption is a very good example of this. Look at I don't know if you follow the news, but earlier this year, one single protester, basically, and all that, managed to more or less bring down the government and forced through some parliamentary bills in Parliament, which successive political parties are not able to do, just through the sheer power of open protest, which got millions of people on his side in an anti-corruption move. So a very open and healthy, basically healthy political culture. I'll stop soon, don't worry. A quick word now just about abroad. India is quite introverted because it's like many continents. You can live in India and forget there's a world outside. India's complicated enough. America suffers from that in a big way. If you've been to the middle of America, you know that abroad seems an awful long way away. India isn't yet quite as technologically or economically successful as America. It may get there one day. And India lives in a difficult region, so India can't completely ignore abroad. But it is the giant of that region. And that is part of the problem and part of the strength as well. Because once it can sort out its region, India has behind it not 1 million people, but almost 2 million people in that penumbra of South Asia. But it has complex relations with each one of its neighbours, which are partly because there are some pretty difficult neighbours. But India doesn't always help it in its neighbours. If we want to talk about that in discussion, I'm very happy to do so. I think the Indo-Pakistan relationship merits a Vinten lecture unto itself. So having had Russia in prison, now we're looking upwards with India. If you want to look at Indo-Pakistan, you're back down a bit because that's depressing. But hopefully they'll come out of that tunnel into the shining light of the 21st century. But I'm just going to talk about two relationships which do matter for the 21st century. And the first is not the United States, it's China. China and India are these two huge Asian powers. As I said just now, 4 times the economy in China, roughly the same number of people, but aging. India overtakes the workforce in the next decade, actually, of China. But completely different in their approach to how they run themselves. At the moment, they're getting on very well. Trade and investments are swimmingly, they sort of love each other, and they're all very great. But deep down, these two giants are competitive. Nobody kid you about that. I'm outside government now, so I can say what I like. These are huge competitors for power, for influence, for space, for resources, and actually even sometimes in ideas, for models of how you run an economy. And as you probably picked up from where I've been talking, I mean, I see a deep strength in India which will help it sustain it through this century in an increasingly more powerful relationship with China. At the moment, obviously, the power is a bit the other way around. But don't forget that these two countries went to war in 1962. When I say went to war, China invaded India in 1962, and then for some extraordinary reason withdrew. There's still an unsettled border between China and India, right along the top. That was a little spat in the press the other day about just that, because the Chinese sort of wrote a map that was basically wrong, where the border drew. So just watch this space. This is my second watch this space tonight. First was education in India. The second is China in India. It's going to be one of the most important, probably the most important international relationship of the 21st century. And we Europeans, Europe is another interesting lecture itself, but we Europeans neglect that at our peril, and most of us Europeans do neglect that at our peril. We are too myopic, too internally focused. China and India have a very important relationship to manage over the next 20, 30 years. My very, very final point is the relationship with Britain. We've been through some of the reasons that Britain knows and loves India and has had an actually extraordinarily interesting relationship in the last 50 years of Indian independence. But what do we share? Lots of things together. We share a language, we share a similar sense of democracy, we share a legal system, we even share each other's food. When Britain has a terrible food. When we adopted a world food for our own, it was Indian food that is now top of our pops. And we play cricket together. I don't say that facetiously. The fact that we both beat each other every other month at cricket shows an interesting engagement which is also competitive. And that's a very important bridge for us in the 21st century, for us, this tiny little offshore island of Europe. But don't forget, this is about not only the size of one small Indian state. We do have a natural bridge to India for those reasons I mentioned. And for one other reason, which is terribly important, Britain has about 2% of our population who are born of Indian origin, many of them through East Africa, but of Indian origin in Britain. And that 2% of Britain is responsible for about 5% of our economy. It is one of the most successful minorities, if not the most successful minority in this country. And we overlook that, again, at our peril. Here is a fantastic human bridge, as well as all the other bridges, for us to take forward cooperation with India as it goes into the 21st century. And I'll finally, just link that back to the RSA, you've got this huge change in India. You've got societal challenge, you've got education, you've got new ideas, but based on a deep cultural background. And what are we in business for in the RSA? What have we been in business for the last 150 years? It's exactly that. It's harnessing the best things of the past, translating them into the modern societal challenges, and going forward with a new idea. So I think there's a real role for RSA back in India. And I hope all of you, obviously here because you like India, have some interest in India, take away from that a personal commitment with your RSA hats on or whatever hat it is, just to push forward Britain's links to India in the 21st century. Because if you don't, your children and grandchildren will think you missed a trick. So let me stop there, and you've been very patient, which is an Indian virtue. I'm glad you've learnt it already tonight. I think, Joyce, we have time for some questions if you like. So thank you very much.